The sharp winter wind sliced through the evening air as Daniel tightened his grip on his daughter Lily's mittened hand, guiding her across the old bridge they had taken as a shortcut home. The single dad's mind was heavy with unpaid bills, the cost of groceries, and the constant ache of raising his daughter alone since his wife's passing, but all those worries faded the moment his eyes caught sight of a figure standing ahead. A woman, thin and frail, clung to the railing of the bridge, her worn coat flapping violently in the gusts, her shoes barely holding together, and a tattered bag on the ground at her feet. Something in her stance told Daniel she wasn't simply standing there, she was deciding. He slowed, his breath catching, as Lily tugged his sleeve and whispered in a trembling voice, "Daddy, what's she doing?" The sight pulled at a memory too raw to ignore, the nights he too had felt on the edge, lost after his wife's death, ready to give up if not for the small hand that now squeezed his own. Summoning courage, Daniel told Lily to stay close behind him as he carefully approached the stranger, each step deliberate, as though one wrong move might push her further toward the void she stared into. Her eyes lifted to meet his for only a moment, and they were filled with despair so deep it made his chest ache. "Please," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind, "just let me go. No one will even notice." Daniel stopped a few feet away, his voice steady but gentle, carrying the weight of his own scars. "Not today," he said, firm but not harsh, his words cutting through the silence like a lifeline. The woman flinched as though struck, her body trembling as tears welled in her eyes, her fingers tightening on the cold rail. Daniel's heart pounded, but he stood rooted, unwavering, his gaze locked on hers. "I noticed," he continued softly, his voice raw with conviction. "And that's enough. Not today." For the first time, something flickered in her expression, not surrender, but the faintest glimmer of hesitation. And in that fragile pause, hope found the smallest crack to slip through. Her name was Emily, and though she had resisted Daniel's kindness at first, ashamed of the tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, she eventually allowed herself to be guided from the bridge, clutching her bag like it was the last piece of herself she still owned, and together with Lily they walked through the icy streets toward Daniel's small, worn-down apartment. The place was nothing grand, peeling wallpaper, an old couch that sagged in the middle, and a heater that groaned as if protesting its own existence, but to Emily, it was warmer than anywhere she had been in months. Lily hurried inside with childlike excitement, already pulling out plates from the cupboard, insisting they make room for their guest, while Daniel quietly opened the pantry to take stock of what little food they had left. There wasn't much, but he pulled out a packet of spaghetti, half a jar of tomato sauce, and a loaf of bread that was nearly stale, and as the water boiled on the stove he glanced over at Emily, who sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting around the apartment as if she didn't belong there. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice shaking, but Daniel only shook his head, his hand steady as he stirred the sauce. "Sometimes we all need someone to remind us we still matter," he replied, the words carrying the weight of his own lonely nights when he too had needed a reminder. When the food was ready, Lily carefully set the table and, with a seriousness far beyond her years, pushed the largest portion toward Emily, who hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked up the fork. The first bite made her close her eyes as tears spilled down her face, not from the taste but from the unfamiliar feeling of being cared for. "Why?" she finally managed, looking at Daniel with disbelief. "Why help me when you don't even know me?" Daniel looked at Lily, then back at Emily, his voice low but resolute. "Because once, when I lost everything, a neighbor showed up at my door with a meal and a prayer, and that small act kept me standing when I thought I'd fall. Sometimes all it takes is someone saying, 'Not today.'" Emily bowed her head, her tears falling silently onto the plate, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't crying from despair, she was crying because a flicker of hope had returned. The days that followed stretched into weeks, and though Daniel still worked long hours at the auto shop to keep the bills barely manageable, he never once asked Emily to leave, despite the fact that keeping another mouth fed made things even tighter. Instead, she slowly began to carve out a place in their home, starting by sweeping the floor without being asked, cooking small meals from whatever little Daniel brought back, and even mending Lily's torn school uniform with an old needle she carried in her bag. At first, she moved like a shadow, hesitant and unsure, as if at any moment she would be told she didn't belong, but Lily's unfiltered affection softened her edges, the little girl often climbing onto her lap with a book or insisting Emily braid her hair before school, saying things like, "You smile more now, Miss Emily, so you must be getting better." In quiet moments, Emily began sharing fragments of her past, how she had once worked as a receptionist, how she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, and how everything crumbled after losing her job and being abandoned by the man she thought she would marry, leaving her with debts and no family willing to help. Daniel listened without judgment, recognizing in her voice the same hollow notes he had once carried after his wife's death, and though he didn't say it aloud, he found himself grateful that Lily wasn't the only one filling the silence of their home anymore. But just as life seemed to steady, the fragile peace was tested when one evening a man appeared at the auto shop where Daniel worked, a tall, harsh-eyed figure who sneered when he saw Emily waiting nearby. It was her ex-fiancé, and his words dripped with venom as he accused her of running away, demanded money he claimed she owed, and threatened to drag her back into the life she had barely escaped. Emily froze, her body trembling with old fear, her instinct screaming at her to run before everything fell apart again, but before she could retreat, Daniel stepped forward, his voice like steel as he said, "She's not alone anymore, and if you want to hurt her, you'll have to go through me." The man sneered, muttered a curse, and stormed off, but the encounter left Emily shaken, torn between fear and a newfound realization, someone had finally stood up for her. The confrontation with her past left Emily rattled, her nights haunted by the echo of cruel words and old betrayals, yet each morning she awoke to the sound of Lily's laughter and Daniel's steady presence, reminders that she was no longer facing life alone, and slowly she began to replace fear with determination. With Daniel's encouragement, she applied for a job at the small diner down the street, her hands trembling as she filled out the application, but to her surprise the owner, a kind woman with sharp eyes, hired her on the spot, giving her a chance to prove she was more than the broken person she believed herself to be. The first paycheck she earned in years was small, yet when she handed Lily a lollipop bought with her tip money, tears pricked her eyes because it wasn't about the candy, it was proof that she was rebuilding, step by step. Life didn't suddenly become easy, Daniel still came home exhausted from the garage, bills still piled on the table, and Emily still fought the whispers of doubt that told her she wasn't enough, but every time those thoughts threatened to drown her, she remembered Daniel's voice on the bridge, "Not today," and clung to it like a promise. Weeks turned to months, and one crisp afternoon they found themselves walking together across that same bridge, the wind cold against their faces but their hands warm, linked tightly as though none of them could ever slip again. Emily paused by the railing, her heart hammering as memories surged back, but this time she wasn't standing on the edge of surrender, she was standing beside a man who had pulled her back from it, and a child who had unknowingly healed parts of her she thought were gone forever. "You gave me a reason to stay," she whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to Daniel, and he, with a quiet smile that carried both weariness and hope, wrapped an arm around her and Lily, saying, "Not just to stay, to live. And we'll keep saying it together, not today, not tomorrow, never again." In that moment, the three of them, once broken in different ways, stood as something whole, not bound by blood but by choice, courage, and love, and as they walked off the bridge hand in hand, Emily knew with certainty that she had finally found her place, her family, and her future.